Hi everyone and welcome back to ThursDev. I am Luke and we are continuing today on the topic of video game business models. Last week we started off this series talking about the progenitor of video game business with the coin-op video arcade game. Thanks in part to the already existing popularity of pinball, it wasn't a big leap by any means to start getting people to shell out quarters for a fix of Pac-Man, Space Invaders, or Centipede. As improvements in technology allowed for the rapid shrinking of computers in the 1970s, they began to become more of a common item, and with that came the opportunity for enterprising companies to capitalize on the concept of home video game entertainment. Though we think of arcades as having a big lead on home video gaming, there wasn't really that many arcade games on the market by the time we saw the first video game home console. Though primitive, the Magnavox Odyssey was released in 1972, and over 3 years, though never really becoming the cultural institution that some of its descendants did, became a reasonable success in an infant market, selling over 350,000 units by 1975. It shipped together with 12 small printed circuit boards, which it called game cards, that physically changed the way that parts of the console accepted and interpreted inputs. And over its lifespan, more game cards were added to the Odyssey library, marking the first instance of individual premium sales of home video games. One might say it was a little bit too far ahead of its time, however, as though ROM-based games eventually became the norm in the present day, it was a subset of games known as dedicated consoles that dominated the market of the mid-1970s. In essence, it was a miniature arcade board in a housing that would connect to your television and allow you to play one game, like Pong. The success of Pong drove a small industry of ball and paddle games, including the wildly successful Coleco Telstar, but over time the popularity of the dedicated console began to wane, as you would be paying a large amount of money for a piece of hardware that could really only play one game, which would last you only as long as that one game was still interesting to you. In 1976, Fairchild Semiconductor released the Channel F, which kicked off the second wave of, and ultimately more permanent trend of, programmable swappable ROMs. Quickly following suit, Atari and Mattel jumped on that home console bandwagon with the 2600 and the Intellivision, respectively, while Magnavox released the Odyssey 2. Simultaneously, there was also a growing home computer industry, which led to a small but dedicated business of printing video game source code in magazines and newsletters, and then eventually on floppy disks that it could sell in stores, onward to CDs, DVDs, digital distribution, and more. Even in the wake of the video game crash of 1983, the PC video game market continued to be a profitable business, and pay-to-own gaming was on the rise. And so began the age of the premium game. This is, one could easily argue, the most agreeable pay model for video games in the eyes of the average consumer. Extremely easy to understand as it follows the usual cash for commodity model of purchase for goods. You pay once, you get the product, easy peasy. There's very little ambiguity in the transaction in this case, which is attractive. The product is complete when it's paid for better or worse, and prior to widespread usage of the internet, even patches were barely existent. Those that were had to be mailed on discs, and usually had the intrinsic cost of postage, though generally speaking most would hesitate to call that a real incurred cost as much as a necessary handling fee. During those dark days, generally speaking, if a company were to want to release more content or even fix their game, it would have to come to the player in the form of a new copy of that game or a new game altogether. This wasn't necessarily set in stone, mind you. Though ROM cartridges and lack of a hard drive made it functionally impossible for consoles, the additional storage afforded to PC owners gave way to exciting new prospects in game development. As early as 1981, we began to see the adoption of what we would one day eventually come to call DLC, or downloadable content. Of course, without the internet or a widespread concept of downloading to fall back on, back then they were known as expansion modules. Now, feel free to mentally make a footnote that nearly everything that I talk about here, with the exception of any historical content that I mention, can also be filed under the banner of DLC, but I'd like to distance myself a little bit from purely calling this DLC, as downloadable content implies a download, and there was what is now modern DLC long before there was downloading. There's a lot more that goes into these models, and though all DLC is content, not all content is DLC, but I'm getting off track. One of the earliest computer game expansion modules that we know of was created by a game company called Epix, known perhaps most well for its Summer Games series of titles. In 1981, they released an expansion module for their Dungeon Quest Temple of Apshai game called Upper Reaches of Apshai, using the base code of the game but adding additional dungeon levels and an expanded storyline. The expansion was sold separately from the game, but required the original Temple of Apshai to play, creating a situation where a player could buy a product for cheap if they already had the preceding product, and get more out of it. This would be the first instance of what is still commonly referred to as expansions. Additional levels, new stories, essentially a new miniature game that expands the content of the original game and uses some of its assets. Though level design was frequently different and it often included other new content, the expansion distinguishes itself from many of its peers in that it has a quantifiable scope that is outside that of the game itself. The mainstream gaming public didn't see widespread adoption of game expansions until later in the decade, but the tradition of expansions gained traction into the late 80s and boomed in the 90s with extremely popular game expansions like Warcraft 2's Beyond the Dark Portal and Wing Commander's Secret Missions. By and large, this kind of content expansion was received pretty well. Though there will almost inevitably always be the usual gnashing of teeth whenever game consumers are asked to pay to play more of a video game, usually the expansion gets the least pushback. And to the present day, some expansions like the recent Blood and Wine for CD Projekt Red's The Witcher 3 are even considered to be superior game experiences on their own compared to many full games released in the same time frame. The expansion was a simple way for the developer to create more game without interfering with the original product, and comparatively had little real impact on the original product itself. It would be little stretch of the imagination to call them, in their own way, games unto themselves, and there are even examples of small-scope games that are so similar to the other games of the same developer that they're referred to as expansions, or expandalones if you like the odd portmanteau, like Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, which you could play on its own without even owning Far Cry 3. In contrast to the expansion, there's also what I'll refer to as content packs, also frequently referred to as add-ons. Where they differ from the expansion is that though they can generally include a large amount of content and even greatly add to the existing game, they generally are much more deeply tied into the game they're added to and don't have a scope that extends beyond it. This can be anything from a single outfit to a single character, all the way up to completely realized missions. Content packs are where we start to tread into the minefield, though, as expansions, in many ways full game experiences in and unto themselves, are generally accepted. The content pack is always under a microscope. When people complain about DLC, this is usually what they're referring to, as it conjures images of premium-priced horse armor or deliberate removal of content so that it might be added back in later at an extra cost to the player. The problem with the content pack is that it can literally be anything that is slotted into the game, and careless game design leads to wastes of money, or even worse, breaking the game's balance. Nothing quite sparks gamer rage like a piece of equipment in a game that becomes seen as essential, even if it wasn't in the original development roadmap. And when the item is seen as an integral part of the game experience, suddenly what was part of an optional purchase now becomes an extra unwritten fee on top of the cost of the base game. Is this right? I'm not going to say that unbalanced content, cut content, or downright pointless content aren't released as content packs. They are, but I have yet to truly, non-subjectively see a piece of content that is essential to completion of a game, except maybe for Asura's Wrath's endgame content. As we've progressed beyond physical distribution, though there are some that still cling to retail, it's becoming increasingly easy to add more content to a game after it's been shipped. As a content creator, this is a huge boon since it means that games no longer have to be abandoned at launch. Even in the wild, if a game is successful enough, we can often get the opportunity to release more content to our players. That extra pack of outfits we wanted to get into the game but didn't have the budget for. That level that had to be scrapped because of time and budget. The storyline that we wanted to tell but wasn't important enough to the story that we could only get a budget to start working on it if the game broke a few tens of thousands of copies. Or that great idea that we had after reading a bunch of forum posts from our players after the game was already out. Content that is outside of a project's budget is one thing, but even then, content packs are hard to design for. Surprisingly so. While the expansion is something of a blank slate, content not only has to be fit into the game on the whole, with considerations made toward the balance of the game when it's added, but also the balance of the game without it should be considered. In the wild west of content packs in the mid-2000s, there were a lot of mistakes that had to be made before we would find the perfect equilibrium. Hell, we haven't found it quite yet. A lot of boundaries were tested and a lot of gamers were angered, but a lot of content was made that never would have had a snowball's chance in hell without. There's no magical equation to say what makes a good content pack that you can still charge for. The only really easy thing to say about creating content packs is there are a few rules that you don't want to break. Like, don't make anything that has the potential to break the game, unless it's completely meant to. Don't make anything that diminishes other content, obsoletes something that you've already charged for. If you're going to charge for something, don't take it away, at least never permanently. And if it's consumable, make sure the player knows that and can't waste their money on it. Don't make anything that renders the base game unplayable without having it. And try to be reasonable with pricing. I know this one's out of most of our hands, but publisher-side producers, you know who you are. Just because you can charge $5 for that outfit doesn't mean that you should. But we're straying dangerously close to the territory of microtransactions now. You see, there's another more contentious part of game business that's cropped up relatively recently that you may or may not be familiar with. Microtransactions are a very touchy topic and deeply tied into DLC. And you may be asking how they even differ from standard DLC to begin with. What's the difference between a content pack and a microtransaction? And what are the different kinds of microtransactions? Because this business has exploded in the last few years. This is not going to be a two-part series, my friends. Next week, we're going to get out of the history of game business and start exploring some of the perhaps frightening realities of the modern game business model. So stay tuned. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I know that it's been a really long preamble and a lot of information that I'm sure you're already aware of, but we've got the sunshine and rainbows out of the way, and now it's time to start to see the dislikes pour in. As well as a few confessions from a pioneer of the free-to-play on handheld model. I hope to see you there. If you did enjoy today's ThursDev and want to see more, a great way to keep tabs on us is to hit that subscribe button. Not only do you get groovy educational content like this, but you also get to hear me be significantly less serious in our Let's Plays, and also hear me rant significantly less coherently on our Sunday video blog, Serious Sunday. Thank you for watching. As always, I'm glad that you stopped by. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.